problem with hatred and love it does not and cannot see. Reading Jane Austen begins with a cut, turns one back into a Freudian. First a dusting of snow, then a light rain, no minimal way to hide our disappointments. From ingrained tracks and tendencies, pattern, recognition, and wind-blown grass.
Let's go ahead and get started.
Okay.
I'm going to just, of course, those of you who are here, this is Jim Rovira. I've known him for a number of years. I'm going to go ahead and just give a brief introduction to him, and then maybe we'll get started and talk about this text. Jim's a higher education professional with 20 years experience in teaching and administration. His areas of interest include William Blake, British Romanticism, literary theory, literature and music, and literature and philosophy. Recently, he published the first-year writing textbook, Writing for College and Beyond with Lulu Press, Reading as Democracy in Crisis, Interpretation Theory History, Rock and Romanticism, Post-Punk, Goth, and Metal as Dark Romanticisms, and Rock and Romanticism, Blake, Wordsworth, and Rock from Dylan to YouTube. U2, not YouTube. Oh my God. That's a little different. So let's just start with the first one. What's your background with William Blake? Why did you start reading Blake, and why is he important to you in your work?
Okay, well, interestingly, I didn't hear about William Blake in college. I was listening to this Daniel Amos album called Vox Humana. It came out in 1984. And on it, there's a song written by Terry Scott Taylor, who wrote most of their songs, but certainly not all of them, called William Blake. And it's a very 80s kind of synth art rock kind of song. But it's totally, I mean, it's about William Blake, and he steals from Blake's imagery to represent Blake's art and poetry in that song. And the chorus is, "You were not mad, I know time will tell, William Blake," you know? So it's like, oh man, I got to read this guy. You know, I love that song so much. I mean, I grew up listening to hard rock in the 70s. So the whole synth pop thing in the 80s, I didn't really buy in, but they started recording in the 70s. So I was a fan of that band. So I followed them through all of their musical iterations. And I went to B. Dalton's bookseller. I don't know if any of you remember B. Dalton's, right? They were in the mall. They were like small. They were small compared to Books A Million or Barnes and Noble. You know, they're always like a maybe, I don't know, a quarter or a third the size of a Barnes and Noble. And I don't know, they went broke when? In the 90s, early 2000s, they shut down. So, but 84, I went there and I bought this book. I want to show you because I still have it. It's Alfred Kazin's A Portable Blake for the Viking Portable Library. And I read it cover to cover, and
was part of my intro to Blake was the Portable Blake.
Sylvia Plath had that edition.
You have it?
No,
yeah.
Sylvia Plath had that edition.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. Yeah. It's a great edition. And I mean, I went back and read his introduction, you know, after as I was doing my dissertation on Blake, and I see he's kind of, I don't know, he's doing his own thing, you know, but that's okay. I think that's what you should do with Blake. I think my favorite collection is Jeffrey Keynes's, because it's like strictly chronological. But I mean, I've relied on so many different ones now. It's really hard to pick one. So anyways, that's when I started reading Blake, is because of the song William Blake by Daniel Amos on the Vox Humana album, which is on YouTube. And then, you know, I read it cover to cover, and, you know, like Jerusalem, like, what the heck is this? And then I invited my undergrad teacher here, Roy Starling. I don't think he's going to join us. But he was my romanticist instructor in undergrad. And, you know, he loved Blake. And I took his American short story class too. He would read Raymond Carver's Fat out loud, and everybody would say, "Oh, you got to take the class to listen to read that story." And then, you know, I started my PhD, and I want to take everything, and everyone's advising me, you don't want to take everything. You need to focus. So, like my first graduate class that I signed up for was 20th century Irish poetry, because I just finished my senior honors thesis on James Joyce. And, and so I've decided to focus on Romanticism and modernism. Those are my two things. And then I did another exam on on the Frankfurt School. And I took some Cotton-Hagel courses. And then when it comes time to do my dissertation, I'm thinking, what do I want to, who's going to keep me interested for the next 20 years when it comes down to it? Let's say I can only write about one person for 20 years. I'd be William Blake.
I think
So
that's one thing that, came up in our back and forth was this idea of Blake as a tradesman.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really interesting because I feel like, I don't know that he, like, in some ways, like, I don't have that background. Like, I have a very, like, sort of traditional college background, but like liberal arts college. But my family kind of does. Like, it's kind of in my family. And I've always felt there's a sense of, like, I think one way that I've tried to connect to my family in some ways is to, like, embrace that part of Blake. Like, it's a way for me to think about, my association with that stuff. And
that's part of it for me too. I mentioned that in my notes that I got married when I was 19 and I didn't start college till I was 23. I worked as an electrician for 16 years. So Blake really appealed to me, being kind of a working class poet. I mean, we think of him as an artist, which he was, of course, but he would be considered as a copper engraver to be a tradesman, in his time. And he had a lot of working class attitudes, and he was, underpaid for his talent, I think. He did pretty, a lot of people saddle him with the starving artist thing, but he really did pretty well in the 1790s. He was able to loan somebody 500 pounds. And the guy's wife got a new dress, but his wife didn't have one. That was kind of an awkward situation for him. But after that, in the 1800s, he didn't do so well. And people stole from him, and were proud of it. He didn't get the recognition he deserved. It was a great experience for me, but it wasn't what I wanted to do my whole life, So I understood that part of Blake too, And I live around Central Florida. I live on the Space Coast. I can drive around Orlando now and point to these buildings and tell my kids, I have the lights there. Drive down East-West Expressway. I did the lights over the signs there. Of course, they've probably all been replaced by now.
Right.
So, but I appreciated that part of Blake too. I felt like, he approached, he was interested in art, literature, philosophy, religion, kind of Hermeticism, if that's separate from any of those somehow. Mm-hmm. Psychology. He comes from a working class background, and at the same time, he attended the Royal Academy. So, there's just a lot of different forces intersecting with him, and that I knew that would keep me interested for a long time.
Cool. So today we're talking about all religions are one, and I wondered what was your. It's funny because I've read that piece several times. I've taught it. I haven't. And I love it, but I haven't done a lot of research into it. So why did you pick that one?
Well, because I've been working on rock and romanticism for a while now. Really started that in 2015 or 2016, and those two books got published. Really, it was only meant to be one book, but I got 50 chapter proposals and 25 completed chapters. So that's not just one book; that's an encyclopedia. It turned into two books.
That sort of speaks to what you were saying earlier, that a lot of people connect to this stuff through music, and through pop culture and stuff like that. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Blake isn't just an academic poet. He's well known among people who are not interested in college at all. And Blake was in there, but I've had my head in kind of rock and romanticism for the last 4 years. I've been keeping in touch with Blake's scholarship by writing reviews. one of which is so ridiculously overdue for Romantic Circles. I've had this book review on my desk literally years.
Oh, wow.
A couple, at least. I'm sorry, but I'm almost done with it, actually. I'm about 1,300 words in, if you'll still accept it, I hope. But that's...
I'm actually not on that. I'm not on that part.
No, you're not on that part of it? Okay, that's
like
Suzanne, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll talk to her.
Yeah.
But I am almost done with that. It's David G.A. Ross's Religion of Empire. This is a great Blake book.
Oh, cool.
So I picked all religions as are one to get my head back into Blake again specifically for this review, especially because this is about Blake's political theology. And it's short, so it's good for a format like this. And it's like an elucidation of a very early statement of his fundamental principles, I think. Those are the main reasons I picked it for this one.
That's cool.
So I kind of wanted to start with Blake kind of close to the beginning. I mean, it's his first kind of illuminated work in which he used his new method of relief engraving. First time he did it, I think, was on those plates. But of course, it's not his earliest works. Those would be in poetical sketches. So that's why I picked it. It was a good place to start for me.
It's striking to me, looking at the plates, how simple yet also beautiful they are, right? Like, and they're very different in a lot of ways. I mean, all of the illuminated poems are different, right? Like, there's difference everywhere, but there's like it's just so different than his later stuff in kind of crazy ways.
It is. I mean,
very small and like.
Right. I mean, look at this.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how well this is going to come across, but I mean, it's a huge sheet of paper and a small etching in the middle of it. And all these borders aren't part of the engraving. They were just added by hand afterwards. This is a print. It's like, I don't know, 4 by 5 centimeters. And the sheet of paper is like 37, 34, something like that. So, I mean, he didn't do anything quite like this before, but this is the first time he's been, relief engraving, where he would, instead of doing it intaglio, where you cover the entire plate with wax and then scratch into it, and then pour the acid on it, and it bites in, and that means the ink would be inside the plate. And you'd have to use a lot of pressure, push the paper down into those grooves to pick up the ink. He did the opposite. He figured out to do the opposite. So he would write and draw backwards, of course, using the stopping out, material, the varnish, wax, or whatever. You put a wax coating around the edges, and then he'd pour acid on the plate and it'd bite into it for some hours. And then he'd clean it all off, and he'd have a raised surface to apply the ink to. And then you didn't have to press nearly as hard. I think he was hoping he could produce a lot quickly that way, and it doesn't work out that way. Yeah, I've had Michael Phillips visit a couple of colleges where I've taught and do demonstrations, printmaking demonstrations. And what happens is you ink it once. It's actually still a time-consuming process, but you ink it once. You have to clean the ink out from the wells, because you want it just on the surface. Otherwise, it's kind of a messy impression. And you can take more than one pressing off it, but each time you got to press a little harder, and you get less ink. So maybe you can do 5 or 6, and each impression is sequentially lighter. And then you have to ink it again. Okay, but it's a lot of fun for students because we get a small press in the classroom and we let them ink the plates and run the paper, run the press. It'd be a little hand press, a small one. It's the first time he tried that. So if you look closely, sometimes the letters are leaning, like sometimes the I are leaning just a little bit this way. He's still getting the hang of writing backwards, which he mastered pretty quickly, I think.
You also don't have the script and the
Right.
and the thing, like very caricature kind of type.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the hand he's writing in is printing and not cursive. I don't know how well you can see it.
It's pretty,
but he never, I don't know if he ever does that quite again, except for maybe like titles or something. But he writes in like a cursive script after this. He uses a different hand. And you can see that the letters are leaning a little bit to the left when you look at it. And I've read some scholarship about the G in Blake. I didn't notice it here, but maybe some of these are a little faint. But his G is like a letter. I mean, the number 8. It's like 2 circles, and at the top it has a little horn on one side. But sometimes the horn is on the other. So he's still getting used to writing in reverse.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I don't know. And there's, from what I understand, there's just one copy of this, I think.
Yeah.
So it's not like he invested a lot. The title page was printed separately. It actually showed up collected with other prints.
Right.
But I think it was on the same kind of paper, so it was actually probably printed at the same time. And this is probably 1788, I think.
Yeah.
Pretty early.
You want to go ahead and read it?
Yeah, sure. Let's read it.
Okay.
I'd like to read the first image with the engraving. What you have is a frontispiece, not before the title page, and it's the voice of one crying in the wilderness. And of course, and you have a seated figure pointing to his left, and he appears to be nude. He has a sheet draped over one thigh. And of course, that's a line from each of the Gospels. And it's one of the things that shows up in all 4 Gospels. It's a quotation, I think, from Isaiah 43. It's used in reference to John the Baptist in the New Testament. All right, so, why is Blake quoting John the Baptist? I see a lot of irony in this. Okay? I see irony and sincerity kind of working at the same time with the same line. And on the one hand, it could be a sincere reference to his own prophetic project. Since it's in the place of the frontispiece, that's usually where the author's picture will be. So he could be pointing to himself as a kind of John the Baptist. And it refers to a crying in the wilderness. It could refer to a sense of isolation too, that he represents a minority opinion in the Anglican Church. Oh, good, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Yeah, that's much better. Yeah. So, you see the seated figure, he's pointing left. And it looks like a younger figure, right? Because he's not bearded,
Yeah.
So, and the point is of John the Baptist is that he didn't point to himself but to someone else, and that's why the figure would be pointing off the edges of the boundaries of the plate. And I would say Blake represents a minority opinion of one in every religious tradition in the world. So he was a voice crying in the wilderness. Yes.
Yeah, that sort of like Blake's. I think that question is really fascinating. To what degree? Because like in a lot of ways, you're talking about, and you say this a lot in your notes, that he's drawing from all of these different traditions, right?
Yeah.
And there's it's so funny in Blake scholarship. There's such a intense kind of energy directed towards trying to pinpoint what his religious.
Right.
Is he a Muggletonian? Is he, Moravian, right? Is he,
right.
all of these things. And what's fascinating to me is like trying to suss out, you know, how we understand belief in that context, right? Like,
Yeah, that's. I mean, if you're gonna ask, is Blake Moravian or a Muggletonian or an evangelical or a Hermeticist or a Kabbalist or an atheist or a humanist or a proto-Marxist? I think the answer to that question is yes.
yeah,
So, he draws from all of that. The question to me about Blake and his traditions is what he does with them, not what he identifies with. And he was a Swedenborgian for a while. I think he attended one of their services, but just one. And then he kind of mocked Swedenborg in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell.
yeah,
I mean, there's good scholarship by Carrie Davies, right, that really places Blake's home background in the Moravian tradition, which I think is interesting. I just talk about a delay in publishing. I was invited to contribute a chapter to Kierkegaard, Literature and the Arts.
oh,
And this was in 2010. And I got the invitation. I wrote it in about 3 or 4 months. I sent it to the editor. It just came out 2 years ago, 2018. So, that really, I wish it could be chapter 2 in Blake and Kierkegaard, because I bring Blake and Kierkegaard together in the Socratic tradition, and I say they both come from Moravian households.
so by the way, just really quickly, could you give a little bit of for those of us who aren't deeply into that element of Blake scholarship, what is a Moravian? What is the Moravian Blake?
Oh, good. Yeah. I researched the history of the Moravian Church. And I'm glad you asked that question, because it's really interesting. And I think it explains somewhat Blake's output, if not his belief, okay, his outlook. The Moravian Church started around the 9th century, okay, really, I mean, way back, with a couple of missionaries to Eastern Europe who were not Catholic. They came from like maybe the East somewhere. They could have been Syrian Christians. They could have been Coptic Christians, but toward the Eastern Europe end of the spectrum, Middle East, okay. But they weren't Catholic. That's the important thing. And they were missionaries in this area, Bohemia, which it's not. Is it called the Czech Republic still? I don't remember. I think they just changed their name. And again, of course, there were missionaries to the person leading that area, and they converted him, and they established their church there. And then the Catholic Church developed a hegemony across Europe. And to retain their Moravian identity, they met underground, but acknowledged a Catholic identity. So they would meet in homes, okay? And so the Moravian Church from the very beginning adopted an identity that was a kind of a subset within a larger kind of Catholic culture. And then they increasingly got stamped out until there was just, a few isolated families. And then Zinzendorf, inspired by Philip Spener's Pietism, which is, I argue in a conference paper in 2011 that Pietism is the starting point for existentialism. Oh. Kierkegaard is a hinge between this Pietist tradition and influenced by Romanticism, and then the beginnings of existentialism. Because it's about really being a Christian. What does that mean? That's the question. That was Kierkegaard's fundamental question.
Yeah.
And Zinzendorf wants to establish Pietist communities, so he starts gathering Moravian families to settle on his estate, to establish a Moravian community, to gather them up, and they can be Moravians here together and not worry. He gets about 300 people. And then he becomes a kind of missionary for the Moravians, and he goes all around Europe, and he lands in England at the Fetter Lane Church And he holds these services in London, and in attendance in those services are the Wesleys and Blake's parents.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Yeah, at the same time. And we have records, attendance records, and that's how we know. And that's the archival scholarship that's been done. And Blake's parents buy in. And Blake's mother was married to another man who I think passed away, and she had to go to the church to get permission to get remarried to Blake's father. And the Wesleys were part of that church at the same time. So what you have is the establishment of the Moravian Church initially as yet another dissenting group in England, but they're already used to establishing their own Moravian identity within the context of a broadly Christian culture that's something else.
Mm.
So that's why the Wesleys were part of this and said, no, we're still Anglicans. We're not Methodists. We're just doing this within the Anglican Church, even though we kind of have our own churches. And of course, they did establish a Methodist church toward the end there. And that's why, Blake's parents would probably think of themselves as Anglicans generally, but they're Moravians.
Mm.
And that's Blake's background. And there's you read Zinzendorf, he has a very kind of Socratic ironic attitude toward cultural Christianity throughout Europe, as did Kierkegaard and as did Blake. And I'm pointing out that one of the shared Moravian influences that they both had was this kind of Socratic irony toward cultural Christianity. That's something they had in common.
How would that, what does that mean? So Socratic.
Oh, okay. Well, Socrates.
In terms of you don't have to I know Socratic in terms of there's a question answer kind of element, but just in terms of how would that emerge for these people in terms of how they viewed Christianity? Yeah.
I think it would be an ethically oriented critique of state Christianity that maybe appealed to them on the basis of seeking some kind of authenticity. Mm-hmm. So what you have with pietism, I think, is the origin of the idea of authenticity, which is not maybe articulated as authenticity, but that's where the idea starts.
Interesting.
In my opinion. So when I'm losing my mind, Theodor Adorno writes the jargon, and Adorno wrote a thesis on Kierkegaard, okay? And I would really I see a lot of Kierkegaard in Adorno. I think he was really annoyed with Kierkegaard's religious kind of orientation, but he really took a lot from Kierkegaard too. And he didn't plagiarize like Heidegger or Sartre did. Adorno, I think, was really doing his own thing here. But when Adorno is critiquing the jargon of authenticity, he's attacking Heidegger, but it's kind of the existential tradition started by Kierkegaard, influenced by pietism, as it finally kind of culminated in Heidegger in Adorno's day.
Interesting. So just as a sort of final kind of thing before we get to Q&A, I think it's interesting to kind of see all of these influences go into this sort of thesis. Of course, this idea that all religions are actually the same.
Right.
At their source isn't new to Blake, right? But I think that there's kind of both in this idea of the poetic genius that he brings up in this text, and then also this idea of a kind of, it's all the same kind of this spiritual kind of element to this work. You can see that kind of, I think, that influence of this kind of oppositional connection to religion, right? It's not important that I follow the law. It's important that I, have a kind of connection to God, right? It's important that that there are these trappings that aren't really real, but what's real is what's underneath it, right? This kind of authenticity that's
right.
It.
That's okay. Well, let me just read Principle the First and give you my reading of that.
Sure.
So the poetic genius is the true man, and that the body or outward form of man is derived from the poetic genius. Likewise, that the forms of all things are derived from their genius, which by the ancients was called an angel and spirit and demon. So when you go through a different place, you'll see different icons representing different world religions. You know, you have the pyramids, you know, maybe a reference to the Celts. You know. And as all men are alike in outward form. So, I mean, you know, you look at a physical body and you can identify the physical body as a human body, whether it's male or female, regardless of what part of the world or what age. Okay. So we obviously don't all look the same, but we have enough of a human resemblance that we can be identified as human.
Well, and it's interesting, by the way, just as an aside, it's interesting how that question of sex sort of comes off of what Claire was talking about last week.
Yeah.
Like that he definitely sees, there is a kind of like not an ability to see the indistinctness of that, right?
Right.
Yeah, but go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. So what I want to do, this is going to sound weird, but I want to read a part from the Catholic Catechism. Okay. And this I think will really draw in the medieval influence on Blake's thought. I'll never say Blake is a Catholic. That would be like saying Blake is everything else. It'd be reductive. Okay. But listen to this. The unity of body and soul is so profound that one has to consider the soul to be the form of the body.
Mm.
Okay, now obviously this is from the modern Catholic Catechism, so it's much more likely that they were reading Blake than that Blake was reading them. But it is because of its spiritual soul that the body made of matter becomes a living human body. Spirit and matter in man are not two natures united, but rather their union forms a single nature. Okay, so we're used to a body, mind, and body soul dichotomy in Protestantism, but that's not medieval thought, which the Catholic Church is the kind of inheritor of. Where's my Zoom? Okay, so I mean, Blake, I mean, you know, we got to be careful about talking about Christianity as if it were this big single thing. It's not. You know, we don't want to talk about Catholicism as if it's a single thing, because it's not. You have Catholics who are very fundamentalist Trump supporters, and you have liberation theologians in Central America who are Marxist. You know, and you have the socialist workers movement in Catholicism. And then theologically, there's the experiential mystical range, and then there's a systematic range of thought. So, but this point of contact, I mean, what Blake is saying here, that body and soul are essentially a single thing. And the Catholic Church refers back to the Council of Constantinople in 870 to support their assertions here. This is a very old idea of you know, that Blake is expressing here. So when he says poetic genius, I think what he's doing is taking that spiritual soul that the body is the outward form of it, that unity, a fundamental unity of body and soul and body and mind, and he's applying his own term, the poetic genius, to that. Mm. And of course, we all have you know, the poetic, you know, genius expresses itself in our specific outward form, like it might express itself in the outward form of a tree or a lake or an ocean or a sky or something. And but you know, I think his theology is just on this one point, and not throughout, but on this one point is medieval. Okay, it's Catholic. But he says poetic genius instead of spiritual soul, because I think Blake's conception of God, first and foremost, is that God is an artist. Mm. And Blake's theology is aesthetic at its roots. So imagine developing a theology in which your first and primary conception of God is as an artist. Mm. And I think that's where Blake is coming from. Yeah. Okay.
Interesting. Yeah.
So, and that's why he says poetic genius.
Cool.
You know, so, you know, and that first principle that he elucidates, the argument as a true method of knowledge is experiment. The true faculty of knowing must be the faculty which experiences. That's argument. This faculty I treat of. I mean, every commentator identifies that with Lockean and Baconian empiricism.
Mm.
This great volume of the early illuminated books goes into really nice detail about the other sources of Blake, like Lavater, whom Blake etched Fuseli's illustrations for. And it's just, I mean, on the level of verbal similarity, there's a couple of aphorisms that are very similar to Blake's. But I think this Blake is expressing a rational, empirical, natural philosophy kind of point of view to co-opt its terms and take it down in that way.
Yeah.
So when he says the true faculty of knowing must be the faculty which experiences, sure, but you don't really think our experience is just limited to the natural world, the material world.
Yeah.
I mean, Blake's argument fundamentally is that we could not even conceive of something that wasn't physical if all we ever experienced were physical objects, if those were the only things we experienced. So our minds would go in a little circle around and around the materialism of the world if all we ever experienced were through the physical senses. So Blake is like taking down that statement by co-opting its terms, by taking the faculty that experiences and expanding it to mean things that are not merely sensory.
Well, I think that's great. I think, when I read that the last time, and I can see people seeing the word experiment and kind of going to science with that, but I can also see experiment in the creative sense, right?
Right.
That your life is something that you can experiment with, right? And that by that we sort of aesthetically create ourselves in the same way as God sort of creates the universe. And I'm also reminded, I think this is from There Is No Natural Religion, where he says, God becomes as we are so that we may be as he is.
As he is, right.
And like,
There's no natural religion.
Yeah, you can see.
I mean,
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, so like if you want to read him as an evangelical, that's very much a statement of the incarnation. But at the same time, he's not just an evangelical, right? So you can't just say he's only that. That's just one of his many influences. He said many kind and supportive things with the Methodists in his later poetry. And he empathized with the Wesleys and with the monks in their cells who created these illuminated books. And not so much with Bacon, Newton, right? But again, he co-opts everything for his vision, I think.
Yeah.
So that's in There Is No Natural Religion. And I mean, in this text, toward the end, he says the Jewish and Christian testaments are an original derivation from the poetic genius. So, I mean, the idea of the poetic genius, since it's a basic human thing, every religion is united as part of one religion because we are all derived from that poetic genius everywhere across the world at all times. So all religions and philosophies as well. But he still kind of privileges the Jewish and Christian religions as an original derivation. And that seems to be possible through the idea of the incarnation. Like suppose like the original poetic genius somehow became human, right? So again, I mean, this is a very Christian reading of the text, and that's not the only reading of the text. I read some scholars say, well, yeah, Blake was basically Orthodox. And I don't think that. I mean, I get the impression sometimes that he thinks the whole Virgin Mary thing was made up to cover for Mary. It was just kind of normally pregnant, right? Only she wasn't married. So, I don't know. Yeah. But that's one way I can like kind of bring this together in a whole. Is he was certainly influenced by the medievals, I would say, in his theology and his art, in calling it, and we call it illuminated books. We have the illuminated Bibles of the medieval period. And this is some of the ways that his those influences show, I think.
Cool. Cool. All right, I'd like to open it up to questions. So who wants to ask a question?
Oh, Claire is asking a question by chat.
Well, I
Okay.
could ask it by,
Oh, good, by video,
yeah.
great.
I just turned off my video so I could make myself a cup of tea while you were talking. So when you were talking about the medieval, like the approach to the illuminated books, I'm afraid it brought to mind, unfortunately, Deleuze. I'm sorry to say.
No, don't apologize.
But just in this, that Deleuze makes this claim about the history of philosophy, and he refers to Duns Scotus and that tradition that runs ontologically, in which everything, every particular in the world shines by its own inner light, right? And I've always thought, it wasn't until I've always thought that Deleuze sounded a lot like Leibniz rather than Kant, right? That each particular opens to the infinite as opposed to Kant, right? You need a subject to grasp the whole. And I think you're right. It never occurred to me that the reason why Blake often sounds like Deleuze is because Blake often sounds like Leibniz, which is more his historical contemporary. But really that's an ontology that goes back to Duns Scotus, right? And then it was just interesting that you said, and that would make sense then with the illuminated books, right? That you get an aesthetic. That's not a question, I guess, now. I guess it's
No, I'm glad you made those connections. They're great. And there's a lot of Blake scholarship tying him to Leibniz too.
Right, yeah. But then if you think, well, why, right, it would be because there's both a holding on to that medieval ontology of particularism and immanence, right, that gets washed away with Kant, right? And we normally associate Kant with romanticism. Yeah, and that would also give you that aesthetic of God as an artist as well. And everything in the world is sort of an artist.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and this, we should read this as a rejection of Platonism. You know, everything's not just a copy of a heavenly form. Everything has contains its own version of the infinite.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, Blake, come on, to generalize this to be an idiot.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's a critique of art, okay, so Joshua Reynolds.
Yes.
But I believe he would extend that in the way you're describing right now. You know, the particular form of a thing is its expression, unique expression of the poetic genius.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that also ties to his art, his emphasis on line.
Yes.
I mean, that's where you really define it. He hated oil painting as blobs of splotches of paint.
Yeah.
You know, he's very strong on line. He has his own kind of blobby stuff too sometimes. The color printing was a little blobby.
Yeah.
But
because he wanted to make each one distinct, right?
Exactly.
You something, but you add some blobs to make it different from the other thing you printed, right? So
thank you for that conversation, because like that totally, I have wrestled with that, the whole thing with indistinction for like years, because like, I always loved Turner and I love indistinction, and like I'm always like, why is he talking about, like I get really annoyed with him. It's really interesting.
I have a question that follows up, and maybe I don't know whether Jim and Claire you want to address this, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot as I'm kind of venturing into writing about Blake. Specifically, I want to know from your perspectives whether or not you believe that there is a synthesis in Blake. This is and I know, Claire, I sort of have my answer from reading your book, but a little bit.
David, just for clarification's sake,
yes.
What do you mean by synthesis? Like,
all right, so I'm trying to think about Blake as a lyric poet, and to do that, and I'm trying to do it without going back to the old version of Blake scholarship that we have. So I'm trying to expand lyric rather than reduce Blake.
Right.
And in doing so, I'm trying to think about whether or not there's certainly not the kind of dialectical movement that you notice in other lyric. It's a different sort of surfacey synthesis, if there is something like a synthesis. And I'm interested from your perspectives, and this was brought up by the conversation of going back to a pre-Kantian sort of way of thinking, whether or not there is a way to conceptualize something like a synthesis. Is that helpful, Roger? Did I? Okay.
Oh, well, that's a great question. I'm really looking forward to reading what you write. And I have a journal with one of your articles in Poetics up there, and I need to get to it soon. I mean, I think Blake's thought I don't think he really changes a lot, but he does kind of transform. In The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, I don't see a synthesis in a Hegelian sense. I don't see a dialectic. I think the opposing forces need to remain opposing and intact for progress to be made. Okay? And I think this kind of ties into his view of anthropology we're kind of talking about now, that body and soul are not in a dialectic. They're part of a unity. So I think male and female are not in a dialectic. They're part of a unity, you know? And you can read even Genesis that way, you know, God created man in his own image, male and female, he created them. So like, you know, man, I mean, you know, we got to deal with the sexist language, okay? But, you know, man is a synthesis or a combination, a unity of male and female. So I would say he's into a unity, but not a synthesis in the Hegelian sense,
Right.
where you have a thesis and an antithesis, and they
see that particular view of Hegel is being kind of rejected
that's very
now.
simplistic.
Yeah, by a number of people, and so it's this. I mean, it's on the basis of this other kind of dialectical movement that the sort of new Hegelians or the new Lacanian Hegelians or the new whatever Hegelians are trying to work out that I'm interested. Claire, did you want to say anything?
You mean people like Adrian Johnson?
I do, and and Todd McGowan and some others, and
okay. So what are they? Wait, I'm gonna intervene right here and like.
Do this offline. Yeah.
This because I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're the boss. I'm so sorry. I see
That was great. I appreciate you bringing.
I just feel like I always listen to this podcast, 10% Happier, and it's like a meditation one, and somebody will like give this like they'll give this shorthand for some like Buddhist idea, and like. The Dan Harris is always like, what does that mean? Like, that's all he does throughout the entire. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, can I just say to that though, without going into the Hegelian thing, which I will take offline. I think the point about lyric though is really interesting, right? Because you have you don't at all have a synthesis, because if you think about when we read Blake and when we teach Blake, it's the opposite of like the Victorian dramatic monologue, where a voice is a diagnosis of a symptom, right? And that happens in Blake, and then suddenly like, wait, who am I reading? Wait a minute, is this Satan?
Right.
Where so you have this drama, you think you're going to get this drama where a voice is a comportment or a voice is an attitude to the world, right? And you get that in Hegel, right? Show me a voice and I'll show you a way of seeing. But the problem with Blake is it flips over, right? So what becomes forgiving, right, which is this type of voice, can become mildness and pity, right, which is then creepy, right? Or what can become defiant, what starts as defiant and revolutionary ends up becoming accusatory and ressentiment. So I think that's why I think lyric in Blake is so interesting, right? Because normally lyric is a unifying power of voice and a unifying poetic. And Blake is a lyric poet because these are voices, right? It's all voices, right? Yet a voice mutates. So that's my, I'll talk to you about Adrian Johnson later. But yeah, thank you, Roger, for policing that.
Oh yeah, thanks.
That's a great discussion. It's and reading Rosso's book on Blake's political theology, it really helped me to get a sense of what Blake does with his mythological characters. He's focused on the character of Rahab, okay? And when you read Rahab throughout Scripture, she means so many different things. I mean, she let the spies into Jericho. Her family was saved. She's a figure of faith in the New Testament, but then she's associated with the dragon and with Babylon in the Psalms and Isaiah, okay? So when you see Blake's mythological figures transform and change, and this is tied to the idea of lyric poetry and a voice, I think they all exist simultaneously for him in a phenomenological field, and their different characteristics are activated by different historical contexts. And that's why the same figure will transform, even from male to female, or from a horror to a dragon to a beast to a, and the transformation of Satan. I think that's simpler because it mirrors the transformation of Satan from Paradise Lost at the beginning to Paradise Lost at the end, and then especially Paradise Regained, where he's kind of a smarmy, Weasley kind of Satan, and not this grand figure at the beginning of Paradise Lost. He's like a passive-aggressive Satan at the end.
I wonder if the same, talking about these questions of like transformation, the same kind of points about Leibniz could be made about the character, that, we aren't like some kind of totality of all of these things, but viewed from very different perspectives, I don't know, so the point that Claire was making last time that or I don't know, I can't remember if I read this from you, Claire, or if you said it, but the idea that Kant thinks, I read this obviously, but Kant thinks of the sublime as like this totality that God, is in control of. Whereas, for Leibniz, that totality is made up of all of these differing perspectives that open up into the infinite, right? Like it's not, and I think you could think about the character in that way too, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and characters are never stable in Blake, and I think maybe they're never stable for us either in some ways, I think our character can be revealed in different circumstances, different facets of it. I think Blake is aware of that. And I think, and remember, your reason is not evil. He's a human capacity. The problem is he's out of place. He's trying to run everything and go off on his own. And that's what becomes destructive. So that's his transformation, and the other human capacities are trying to redeem him and forcing a different kind of transformation upon him, making him take a definite form.
I had a question. David Ronson emailed me and said, I appreciate the discussion of Blake's idea of body and soul and the catechism references. And he wonders if you've seen Dead Man and if that connects at all to the discussion.
The film? Like that Western film?
Yeah, the Jim Jarmusch film, yeah.
Yeah. It's been a long time, so I can't really comment on it. But I remember enjoying it. The character was named William Blake, and everyone else quoted Blake's poetry to him, and he didn't understand why. That's what I get out of that.
This is Dead Man, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hey, Rebecca. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm fascinated by this film, and I've heard so many people, I can't really remember how many times I've seen it now. I've heard so many people say this has nothing to do with William Blake and with the real William Blake, and that it's just a random English poet. But I think it's not, because if you look at some of his prophecies, they're global, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so at least the part, where nobody feels that the real William Blake, whom he has found in a book, has something to say to him as a First Nations person, in the 1880s, who essentially is forced to discover Europe, and what he discovers is Blake's London. And the town of Machine is very much, could Blake's London happen in America? Of course, that's why we're drawn to it. It's all of our industrial towns too, so I think there's definitely room for reading that film as trying to have more to say about Blake than sometimes it's been credited for doing.
Yeah, I can't
Yeah.
comment on it. I'm glad you said it's been too
Yeah.
long. I've just
I think if you just limit it to like the 3 or 4 minutes that the fake William Blake spends in this little, apparently a mining town. I mean, it definitely has satanic mills and all that. I mean, it's facile, but it's like if it makes people want to read the poetry, I'm all for that.
right.
I think that's brilliant. I think it's brilliant, and it also ties to Jim what you were saying at the beginning with the song, like what brings people to Blake, and then but then also like I think I really love what you said, Rebecca, about the global and the indigenous perspective and how that kind of changes a lot of the context in ways that I think are very like, you know, Blakean in some ways, right? Like in terms of subverting this kind of like British colonialist view that Blake is, you know, theirs, and that they, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So
I mean, if like I teach Jerusalem all the time, and now that when I see this film, I think, you know, with the plan of building, it's the film, it reveals a lot of a kind of nasty side of Blake that if we reach utopia by building Jerusalem, weirdly in a place where he acknowledges there were valleys once, right? And nobody is the self-given name of the Native American character who is sort of more the protagonist than the William Blake character is. But he is very much interested in unbuilding. That's the only way he's going to get back to his utopia. So yeah.
The other thing that I remember about the Jarmusch film is that trippy Neil Young soundtrack.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
like,
Yeah.
he was just mentioning that.
It really messes with my brain. Like the first 2 times I fell asleep in the middle of the film, and it was because of that stupid sound. Like I was just kind of old. You're kind of like, ooh, you're like tripping, kind of.
But the whole thing is, I mean, it's supposed to be a dreamscape, and it's got a trip in the middle of it. I really wonder whether Jarmusch knew more about Romanticism than people have given him credit for, because it also kind of telescopes into these 3 nasty characters at a campfire who are retelling the story of Goldilocks and the 3 Bears and changing it in a way that justifies settler colonialism. And of course, the original of that is written by Salvi. So I mean, maybe you knew that.
I've written on this film. It's in my book,
okay.
my recent book, Romantic Mediations,
Cool.
Media Theory and British Romanticism. My chapter on Blake opens with a reading of this film, and Jarmusch absolutely knew very much about the Romantics, and most particularly about Blake, and had done a surprising amount of research into Blake on this. And I read it in a different context, I think, different from what David, I guess, was asking about, so I won't kind of comment on my reading of it. But I think it's fascinating that it taps into this kind of question of Blake's moving images for me, that his images are always kind of in like people have been saying here, in the process of becoming. And I think that figure of the dead man, as he, you know, he's dying the entire film, is something to do with this binary between life and death that is so prevalent in Blake.
Yeah. When you say he, just because I'm trying to figure out how to do
I'm sorry, Johnny Depp's.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay.
Character. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to watch the film again.
It's so good. I mean, it's such that high contrast black and white. I'm right there with Roger. Like, it's so jarring, and yet it's so beautiful. And I find the Young soundtrack to be like just reinforcing of that. I fell asleep the first time I watched it, Roger, too. That's so fun. Grad school. Yeah,
I'm going to get your book as soon as the libraries reopen.
Oh,
thank you for
I would
that.
happy to send you I could send the chapter if you'd like.
Really? I would love that.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, I will email you. Thank you.
Email me. Yeah.
I'm also just another Jarmusch film. I really like. I haven't seen it, but I really want to, in the context of what is Romanticism, is Dog, right? Like this kind of that kind of element too, like that recreation of this past for like and relocation of it.
Yeah, he has. I mean, that's another one, but he has quite a few films. Or I don't know, Andrew, if you'd agree. To me, it seems like there are definitely questions about who has access to literature and how that determines what literature is.
Yes, I think that by staging, right, because nobody is like half Blackfoot and half blood, right? And it's also, and then they're on this path to the Pacific Northwest in the end, which I think is fascinating kind of how the film ends. Yeah.
And the way that we in several of his films, there is a non-white character who manages to repurpose canonical white literature in a way that's empowering to him but deeply threatening to most of the other characters. Ghost Dog, obviously, too.
So cool.
Yeah. Or, I mean, the one with The Art of War, too, is completely different. Very similar. Sorry.
Rebecca, can I ask you, like, this is off topic, but do you have the guitar?
Oh, okay. The guitar, okay. Well, the guitar is in a wood shop, which is about an hour away from here, and we can't, I'm sorry, we can't visit it now. It's shared with a 7, but it's like, it's half finished. I've got photos of the guitar at its present state. I have a different guitar by the same maker out there. But
Can you just tell us a couple minutes about?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
If you don't mind, Roger, is that okay?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, sure. So I've always really been interested in I love the Percy Shelley poem with the guitar to Jane. And so my partner, who does some luthiering and has made several other instruments from scratch, has been making a replica of that guitar, which is just a weird guitar. Like, he's discovered some things about, we've gone in, we have 78 research photos of the original in the Bodleian from last summer that are informing this replica. But it's it's a very strange guitar that he got in Pisa and gave to Jane Williams. It's sort of an evolutionary cul-de-sac among guitars. Like, there is no other guitar like it. There is no other surviving guitar or other instrument in the world by its maker, Fernando Bottari. In some ways, it looks more like a violin than a guitar. Like, it's got a curved back, which looks very much like, front of a violin. And so we're trying to see if by making it, we can hear what it sounded like, because the original has been in the Bodleian since 1897. And so, no one has ever recorded it, and now it is not in playable condition. And we're aware of a few other replica projects in England where people have tried to make this guitar, and frankly, we weren't really impressed with the results, and there are no sound recordings. So that's what we're doing. He's making this guitar, and I'm writing about something very, very much inspired by Jim and his collaborators' work on rock and romanticism, about the way that Jane Williams' rebelliousness and her taste in music, and the way that she's depicted in that poem, and also like her responsibility for saving the poem, getting it published, and making the guitar this kind of wooden icon of Shelley that it is kind of rock-like.
Yeah, thank you for contributing that chapter.
Thank you.
That's,
yeah.
I have to need to start reading them soon. So.
Thank you.
Okay, Roger. Anywhere you want to take it from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's one last question, or if people are, what do you think? I think we'll just end. This was awesome. Thanks.
Right.
That was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger and DB, and thank you for Romantic Circles, and thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I don't get to talk about Blake very often around here.
I know. Yeah. No, I'm the same way. I can't teach him, so.
Right.
Like, I just stay away from him because I just don't. I'm too close to it. So.
I do teach him, and
Thank
it is useful. I'm going to use some of what I've heard. Thank you.
Oh, good.
Thanks.
Take care, y'all.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
This is the problem with hatred and love. It does not and cannot see. Reading Jane Austen begins with a cut, turns one back into a Freudian. First a dusting of snow, then a light rain, no minimal way to hide our disappointment.